Brazil, known for samba, football, city of God, and well, sexy people. But in the past year, what do we hear about Brazil? Burning forests, a far-right president, and hundreds of thousands of COVID deaths. You very likely ask yourself, what's going on in Brazil? And here in Brazil, we ask ourselves, how did we get here? Hi there, I'm Nelson Garrone. I'm an independent journalist here in Brazil. 15 years working on television, 3 years working here on YouTube. During the pandemic, I came up with the idea of having my very own YouTube channel. Here I am, and you're welcome. I'm Brazilian, and this is my first video in English. Sorry for whichever mistakes I might make here. English is not my mother tongue. Don't hesitate to correct me on the comments below. Well, I learned that many of my viewers are Brazilians living abroad, and they've been having a hard time trying to explain what's going on here in Brazil to foreigners. So I'll humbly try to do that. And I named this series of videos Brazil Not for Beginners, after an aphorism allegedly said by Tom Jobim, Brazilian songwriter, singer and pianist that composed the most renowned Brazilian song ever, the Go from Ipanema, the one when passed, everybody went, ah. Anyway, that's my idea. Show foreigners how I see Brazil. So don't jump to the next video and stay here for the first Brazil Not for Beginners. Currently, when we hear or watch something about Brazil in the foreign press, what do we see? Our president, Jair Bolsonaro. He's a populist, a threat to democracy, and a threat to the Amazon rainforest. A former army captain nicknamed Trump of the Tropics. He's also the man who, in a Facebook comment, suggested there was one reason behind French president's criticism on Brazil's current non-existing environmental policies. According to Bolsonaro, the French First Lady was not as pretty as her Brazilian counterpart. Bolsonaro also called Swedish teenage environmentalist Greta Thunberg a brat. And believe it or not, he threatened to wage war against the then candidate Joe Biden if he won the election for his stance on the Amazon. Bolsonaro said, when saliva runs out, meaning when there can no longer be any diplomacy, one has to have gunpowder. That is, war. War against the most powerful army mankind has ever seen. In a few words, how is Bolsonaro pictured abroad? He is the far-right former army captain expelled from the army for misconduct and allegedly planning a terrorist attack. Not only does he defend Brazil's former military dictatorship, he commends former torturers. He's also remembered for his links with illegal militias in his home state of Rio de Janeiro. He's pro-gun, pro-family, misogynistic, and homophobic. Yes, he's all that. For us here in Brazil, that's common sense. Even his supporters acknowledge that, and they love him, not despite of all that, but because of all that. Anyway, my aim here is to share with viewers how things are here in Brazil under Bolsonaro. If Brazil were a TV series or Netflix series, he'd be the main character of the current season. There are many other characters, more complex characters, and the screenplay is much more entangled, and countless plot twists unfold almost every day. I'll try to be this story's narrator, or narrator, as Americans say. Spoiler alert, there might be a hint of irony along the way, if you don't mind. In this first video, I'll try to explain why Brazil has done so bad tackling with the COVID-19 pandemic. You might have seen this New York Times cover. Lowy Institute, based in Australia, labeled Brazil the worst among 100 countries when it came to handling the health crisis. Coronavirus took a while to get to Brazil. The virus spread from east to west. First China, it hit Iran hard. In Europe, especially Spain and Italy, suffered a lot. You know that. Meanwhile, here, authorities never worried about testing. On the 3rd of February 2020, our Ministry of Health declared state of health emergency. On the 21st, it was Carnival, the most crowded, popular, sweaty and lustful party in the Brazilian calendar, where gathering is a requirement. It should have been cancelled, right? Was it? Of course not. The world was worried. At that time, every health expert knew the disease was airborne and very, very contagious. Yet, here in Brazil, it was party time. People traveled across the country and did what people do in Carnival. By the end of Carnival, the 25th of February, Brazil confirmed its first case of COVID-19. The patient was a 61-year-old man that lived in Sao Paulo, Brazil's largest city. He had just come back from a trip to Italy. Today, experts know he was probably not the first case, and we'll probably never know who the Brazilian patient zero was. What we can say is that beyond reasonable doubt, Carnival in 2020 was a super-spreading event. The first official death in Brazil was on the 12th of March, also in Sao Paulo. And just one day after that, the World Health Organization labeled the new coronavirus a pandemic. Jair Bolsonaro had just come back from an official trip to the United States. 23 members of his entourage tested positive for COVID-19. A week later, a statement that would epitomize how President Jair Bolsonaro would deal with the pandemic. I should remind you that less than 2 years before, he had survived a stabbing attack during a campaign event. So, on the 20th of March, when asked about the disease, he said, "After the stabbing, a little flu won't knock me down." It was an improv, so one might have thought it was some sort of Freudian slip. 4 days later, though, during a televised speech aired on primetime television, he once again stated that a little flu or a little cold wouldn't catch him because he had been an athlete in the past.
Histórico de atleta. Caso fosse contaminado pelo vírus, não precisaria me preocupar.
This was probably the starting point of a war of versions. On one side, scientists, health experts, scholars, most political pundits, many governors, mayors, mainstream media, and also independent media supporting social distancing, stay-at-home strategy, and quarantine. On the other side, the president and his followers who, unlike the majority of Western governments, believed the pandemic was not that daunting, that lockdowns should not be implemented in Brazil, and that the economy was a priority, and that only people in high-risk groups should quarantine. So two very distinct sides. The federal government even sponsored a campaign to be broadcasted nationwide called Brazil Can't Stop.
Para os quase 40 milhões de trabalhadores.
It incited people to go to work, be them merchants, factory and health workers. They should go back to work, said the campaign.
E os heróicos profissionais de saúde.
The video advised entrepreneurs to reopen their businesses.
O Brasil definitivamente não pode parar.
The Supreme Court intervened and prevented the video from being officially released. But it was already everywhere on social media and the press. And that became the official Bolsonaro policy. Belittle the threat, boycott social distancing, and discourage the use of masks. How would Bolsonaro persuade the population to go back to normal? Well, by doing exactly that himself. He visited local shops, hugged supporters, violating local laws, by the way. The president went out to eat a hot dog on the street, for example, not wearing a mask, obviously. But those were somewhat naive events, if you will. It gets worse. He both summoned and participated in protests against the Supreme Court and Congress. Yes, you heard it. During the pandemic, a sitting president took part in not one, but in many riots advocating that both the Supreme Court and the Congress should be closed. In other words, a coup.
Eu estou aqui porque acredito em vocês.
I'm here because I believe in you, he cried out to supporters gathered outside the headquarters of the army. Protesters demanded military intervention, rejected social distancing measures, and also attacked China. Meanwhile, on social media, President's followers shared the most bizarre conspiracy theories. Here are some examples. Far-right Bolsonaro supporters believe in an alliance of coronavirus, People's Republic of China, and the World Health Organization. They also accuse mainstream media of defending socialist interests in Brazil, among them Brazilian CNN. And they also cast doubt on the effectiveness of wearing face masks. When asked to comment on the 2,500 deaths, Bolsonaro said twice, "I'm not a grave digger. I'm not a grave digger." At the end of the month, the number of deaths had doubled. To reporters, he uttered, "So what? What do you want me to do? That's life." So let's recap. The president told Brazilians to go back to work, took part in large gatherings, showed contempt towards the death, ignored the agony of families, and was helped by anti-science fake news and memes shared on social media. But that wasn't enough. He needed an elixir to make his rhetoric more convincing. There was no effective drug against COVID-19, yet preliminary results about the efficacy of an anti-malaria drug in vitro were enough to entice the Brazilian president to believe that the drug was a reliable COVID-19 treatment. Both him and the then American President Donald Trump embraced chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. The magic drug would enable the country to reactivate the economy, they thought. Trump slowly dropped that idea, very slowly. Our president did not. When Bolsonaro caught COVID himself, he made videos taking the miraculous medicine and said,
Eu confio na hidroxicloroquina.
"I believe in hydroxychloroquine." He was even photographed showing a box of chloroquine to an emu that lives in the gardens of the presidential residence. Bolsonaro stated many times there was no scientific proof the drug actually worked, but since there was no alternative, chloroquine was the best choice, according to him. Despite the lack of proof, the federal government decided to manufacture millions of hydroxychloroquine pills. The government also sponsored the distribution of the so-called COVID kit. Many mayors also gave this kit to the general public. But what is the COVID kit? Well, that varies, but it generally includes hydroxychloroquine, the anti-malaria drug, azithromycin, an antibiotic, ivermectin, a drug against head lice, and sometimes the kit includes vitamin D. By the way, the American Center for Disease Control strongly recommends against the use of chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine with or without azithromycin. And the US National Institutes of Health say there are insufficient data to recommend either for or against the use of ivermectin in the treatment of COVID-19. Back to chloroquine. The pseudo-miraculous drug was the reason behind the quarrel between President Bolsonaro and his own health minister. Before the pandemic, very few people actually knew who Minister Luiz Henrique Mandetta was. He's a doctor and a former MP. When the crisis broke, he became the most notorious authority in the Republic, understandably. At the very beginning, the information regarding the virus were not very clear, even to experts. Mr. Mandetta decided to follow social distancing measures recommended by the WHO. 2 years before the next presidential elections, Mr. Mandetta's popularity skyrocketed. He became a virtual presidential candidate. That sudden rise of his health minister's approval ratings bothered Bolsonaro. Political pundits here in Brazil usually say that Bolsonaro can't stand anybody who dares to steal his thunder. And the last straw was Mr. Mandetta's refusal to prescribe the president's elixir, chloroquine. Bolsonaro fired his health minister in the middle of a pandemic. The following minister was also a doctor. He survived in office for less than a month. he also rejected the prescription of chloroquine to COVID patients. For 4 months during the pandemic, Bolsonaro decided not to appoint a new health minister. The worst pandemic in more than a century and no health minister. Meanwhile, Eduardo Pazuello, a general with no experience whatsoever in Brazil's health system, stood as interim minister. One of his first decisions was, guess what? He changed the ministry's protocol and authorized the prescription of chloroquine to patients with mild symptoms of COVID-19. By the way, the interim minister even took part in those protests I mentioned that defended the closure of the Supreme Court and National Congress. The general himself also tested positive for COVID. Next to Bolsonaro, in a video published on social media, he said he had taken chloroquine and that he was brand new. Pazuello, an active general, never challenged his boss, a former army captain. On the contrary, he was ideologically aligned with Bolsonaro. For that, Bolsonaro officially named Eduardo Pazuello his health minister. There's more. I'll introduce another character, a politician that became Bolsonaro's main rival during the pandemic. The governor of Sao Paulo, Brazil's richest state, João Dória and Jair Bolsonaro had been allies during their campaign in 2018. It's quite easy to find pictures of them together. Bolsonaro became president, Dória, Sao Paulo's governor. But the apparent friendship did not last long. In the pandemic, they turned into opponents. It's widely known that Dória wants to run for president in 2022. The governor announced a partnership with China's Sinovac. The Chinese biopharmaceutical company would provide vaccines to Butantan. Butantan is a biologic center located in São Paulo under Governor Dória's authority. A successful vaccine would likely boost Dória's approval ratings and could rise him to a presidential candidate level. From that moment on, Bolsonaro's followers had a nickname for the vaccine made by China's Sinovac. Vacina. They played with the words vaccine and China in Portuguese, something like Vaxi-China. In Portuguese, it makes more sense if you get the idea. Vaccine, vacina, China, China, put them together, vacina. Bolsonaro had the chance to acquire his own batch of vaccines. Pfizer, the multinational pharmaceutical company, offered 70 million doses to Brazil's federal government. The company's CEO even sent a letter directly to Bolsonaro. No deal was made. Unlike American and European governments, Brazil did not agree to the terms and conditions of the contract. The Minister of Health tried to forge a deal with Butantan, São Paulo's research center that had a partnership with China's Sinovac. But a teenage Bolsonaro follower warned the president on Facebook his health minister was helping Governor Dória in his presidential ambitions. Bolsonaro answered in capital letters, "We will not buy the Chinese vaccine." On the same day, he announced the vaccine deal had been cancelled. He said that he wouldn't buy a vaccine he did not understand. Due to its origin, he didn't believe the vaccine was safe. Sinovac tests had to be halted temporarily. A volunteer had just died. Since Sinovac was the vaccine in a joint venture with São Paulo's research center, Bolsonaro celebrated the death. Later, it was confirmed the death was not linked to the vaccine. The man had committed suicide and he was on the placebo group. Tests resumed. By that time, there were 160,000 deaths. Bolsonaro said that Brazil had to stop being a country of sissies. Yes, denial and homophobia. A week before Christmas, he once again played down the vaccine. In an official event, he teased,
Você virar o chip, virar o jacaré, é problema de você, pô.
"If you take a vaccine and become an alligator, it's your problem." Yes, he said that vaccine could make people become reptiles. An anti-vaxxer president that refused to accept social distancing measures, promoted gatherings, and defended a drug with no scientific proof. You may ask yourself, but is he alone? Well, not at all. A group of physicians supports chloroquine, the pseudo-miraculous drug. Anti-vaxxers are commonplace among Bolsonaro's supporters, and many Brazilians ignore social distancing and defend their alleged right not to wear masks in public.
Cidadão não, engenheiro civil formado.
And herds of people constantly gather in clandestine events. Videos of parties across Brazil are everywhere on social media. That's how many Brazilians celebrated their new year. Brazil had almost 8 million registered cases, just under 195,000 deaths, and no vaccine. I told you, Brazil is not for beginners. Please share this video and subscribe to my channel. Thank you very much indeed for watching. In the next video, 2021, vaccination starts in Brazil. Brazilians die in hospital without oxygen. Police investigate the health minister. And Jair Bolsonaro under pressure. Will he be impeached? See you next time.